Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the reading, Rachel and Daniel and Toby. Thank you very much. As you can see, you might see on the screen, we're looking this morning from 1 Samuel 17 at God's Shepherd King. And we're going to have 3 points, a terrifying enemy, a surprising arrival, and then a stunning victory. So firstly, the terrifying enemy. From verse 1 to verse 11. This is scene 1. There are 2 hills and 2 armies and a valley between them. You can see that in verse 3. If you do have a Bible, we'll be looking at particular verses as we go along. The Philistines hate God, the God of Israel, and hate God's people, the Israelites. It was so helpful, wasn't it, to hear about that and displayed by Anna earlier. The Philistine army have come to win and defeat the Israelite army. Remember last week, Saul is the king of Israel. He's the king that Israelites wanted. He was muscly and tall. I wonder what Saul's heart was in his heart as he and the army faced the Philistine army who had come to crush them into the mud and crush anything to do with God's honor. Well, how would you feel? All their hearts are pounding. They're on the battle lines, staring at a threatening war machine. They're staring at the horrible end to freedom. They're staring at death. And now it gets worse. Up steps Goliath. We've got a picture of Goliath there. He's huge. He's horribly impressive. You can see that in verse 4 to 7, all the description of his armor. And he stands tall and shouts, verse 8 to 10, why do you come out to battle against us? Am I not a Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we'll become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. The stakes are high. There's no more wondering now how Saul and his men feel. You can see that in verse 11. They're terrified. Saul and his army, they are full of muscle and full of armor, but not compared to Goliath. Saul and his men are not full of faith in God. They have faith in armor and muscle, but they don't have enough. In chapter 16, verse 6 and 7, Samuel saw Eliab, that's the eldest brother of David, and he thought, well, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Saul and his men, including Eliab, are trusting in outward appearances. They see and hear God's enemy, but nothing else. God is far from their hearts and minds. They see and hear God's enemy, and from the beginning, God's enemy is very bad, very unkind, full of cruelty, full of lies and deception. And above all, the enemy is full of hatred for the living and true and good God. In verse 10, we get this: I defy you, God people. And all the Israelites, without exception, all of them were dismayed and terrified. Well, in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, chapter 2, verse 14, it says that all humanity are held in slavery to their fear of death. and the devil has a powerful hold over all people, rich and poor. You and I don't have to face a 9-foot giant, but God's enemy is real and active in the world. The spiritual forces of darkness are powerful. No one, not one, has the strength to overcome these evil forces, and no one in the world has the power to beat giant death with its long shadows of despair. Every one of us are dismayed and terrified. Well, scene one ends in a bleak place. God seems a long way off. In York and in Yorkshire, there are sadly, it's full of people still living without hope and still living without God. And in verse 11, all looks helpless and impossible. A miracle is needed. So now we come to scene 2, verse 11 to 40. So that now we have a surprising arrival. You can see David there, and I think there's a staff, isn't there? I don't know if any children have got staffs this morning, shepherd's staffs, but David's got one. And he is a surprising arrival. God is preparing a surprise answer, and the preparations go back years of shepherd work in the Judean hills with its dangerous animals. Well, David was the youngest son. You can see that in verse 14. And David would go to and fro between helping his big brothers who was in Saul's army and taking care of his dad's sheep. See his dad's sheep there? David arrives and has a behind the scenes humble job to do. He is almost an invisible visitor. After all, he is just a shepherd boy. Yet here in scene 2, in verse 14, we get his full ID given, his full identity. Verse 12, David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Was a full description of David. I wonder why. It is like Jesus, when he arrives into the world in humble circumstances in Bethlehem to grow up as a carpenter boy, yet his full ID, his full lineage is given at the beginning of 3 of the gospel books. I wonder why. Well, back to chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, verse 16, the big problem is highlighted. It won't go away. The Goliath, the giant, threatens day after day. And in verse 17 to 19, Jesse gives instructions to his youngest son, David, take food supplies and report back that the big boys are alive and well. So verse 20, David gets up early and obeys his father and reached the army camp as his big brothers and all the other Israelite soldiers were going out to the battle positions and shouting the war cry. And just as David was giving over the food supplies and speaking to his brothers, at that very moment, Goliath steps forward from his Philistine army lines and shouts his usual defiance. Did you spot the word defy as we had the reading? It's a key word in the chapter. The timing is critical. David was in exactly the right place at the right time, and he had had an early start, but he was awake. His eyes and ears were 100% alert. Not only did he see and hear for himself this Philistine champion, verse 23, but he also heard the Israelite reaction. They all ran from Goliath in great fear, terrified, verse 24. Generations later, the Father sent his Son into our world, onto the front line at just the right time, just the right place. Jesus' eyes and ears and heart were wide open to witness close up the suffering of his people and the enemy's grip on all the people. Jesus also heard close up and was on the receiving end of the enemy's taunts and threats and temptations. Back to David. David saw the fellow Israelites' scared faces and he listened to their words, verse 25. And then in verse 26, David speaks. And these are David's first recorded words in the Bible, and we need to listen carefully. What does he say? What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes the disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David sees and speaks something very, very important. Goliath's challenge of the Israelites is a direct challenge to Israel's God. Saul and his army have been blinded by the bravado. To them, this giant is invincible, but to David sees him as despicable, bad-mouthed, all heat, no light. David's words are like warm sunlight. His words are hope-filled, God-filled. They are heartwarming words, unless you're Goliath. Now we get some words by Eliab in verse 28. Eliab is the big brother, and he has big brother put down words for David. He's so dismissive of David, and David's presence is just an embarrassment. But can Eliab see his little brother's heart motives? No. So Eliab just wants to put David down in his place. Now look at verse 32. We get more words from David. And what does David say to Saul? He sees the camp. David sees the camp and all the trembling and all the loss of heart and the feelings of defeat. And he says, your servant will go out and fight the giant. And what does Saul say? You can't do that. You're too young. There's no match. It's ridiculous. And then we get these wonderful words in verse 34 to 37. Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep, and when a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it and struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by the hair, struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and the bear. This God-hating Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. In verse 37, he's saying, God delivered me in the hills, and he will deliver me here in this valley. He is looking back in faith, and looking back in faith means that David looks forward in faith. And it's exactly what Moses and Miriam did in the song in Exodus 15, and what Mary did in her song in Luke 1, and Hannah did after the birth of Samuel. Look, if you've got a Bible, at 1 Samuel 2, verse 10. Hannah, in faith, what did she say? Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will give strength, that is, the Lord will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. So these verses in chapter 17, verse 34 to 37 of David's, they are amazing faith-filled words. And then what Saul do in verse 38 and 39, he gets David kitted up, doesn't he? But now David does look ridiculous. And David doesn't like all this armor. He's not used to it. What does he do? I think in verse 39, you can see he takes the armor off and he dresses as he's used to, as a shepherd boy. And now verse 40, things are coming to a head. So our final scene, a stunning victory, a stunning victory. Verse 41, Goliath kept coming closer. Verse 42, Goliath despised David. You're a nobody. Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And he curses David by his gods. David didn't look impressive, and he didn't have impressive weapons. You can see the weapons that he had there on the screen. But he is full of faith in God. And he killed the giant Goliath with a stone slung probably at about 150 miles an hour at the right point, exactly the right point. And he triumphed over Goliath. This is a stunning victory. Well, at the heart of the Bible is God's rescue of lost sinners from the power of sin and death. And this rescue is at the cross. At the cross. I think we're going to have a slide to remind us of that. God planned this from the very beginning. And in the Old Testament, we get glimpses and promises, we've been singing about them, of this coming rescue. God's victory over the enemy, over evil and death, is not by conventional weapons, not by sword or spear, or by an army, but by one man, God's anointed, full of faith, full of grace and truth. And when God's servant King Jesus went to the ultimate encounter with God's arch enemy, his outward appearance looked very unimpressive, foolish and weak. But God's victory comes through the humility of his king. Many despised Jesus and hid their faces from him in his sufferings and humiliation. But at the cross, God undoes human pride, undoes human cleverness, and the trust in muscly arms and legs. God's weakness is stronger than all human strength. I think we're going to have a slide of a fallen tree now. Can you see that tree, that mighty tree that's now not standing tall, but fallen flat? That, I don't know if any of you have ever seen something like that, a big tree that's been blown over. Well, a mighty tree can be blown over by a mighty wind. You can't see the wind, but you see the results. You can't see God, but when we read the true story of the cross of Jesus and the giant death fallen flat, we see God at work. Jesus died, and on the third day, he rose to the power of an endless life and ascended to heaven. I don't know if any of you have crowns in the house. Have you ever made a crown or a picture of a crown? But Jesus is the king, God's king, isn't he? And there's a wonderful verse, many wonderful verses about him being king. But in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8, I think a bit of it might come up on the screen. God says to the Son, your throne, O God, will last forever and ever, and righteousness will be the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has set you above your companions by anointing you with the oil of joy. The day David defeated Goliath single-handed, there was a lot of running in verse 51. The tables were turned, verse 52. The Israelites were delivered from their fear of the Philistines and Goliath. It was a time of celebration. Well, in David's surprise arrival that day, and in his words, David's words and his actions through chapter 17, we get a window on the person, the character, the grace, and the glory of the shepherd king who would come through David's line centuries later, Jesus. I don't wear a watch. I don't know if anyone does or if anyone's got a watch. Any of the children have got a watch or a clock this morning, but clocks tell the time, hopefully. And it reminds us that about God's timing. You see, at just the right time, on his own, it was solo work. By his death, God's servant king came to destroy him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Jesus came to be your shepherd king. Have you been freed? Jesus said many wonderful things along these lines. I have come to give you life. I have come to be the good shepherd. These are warm, true, sunshine words that are for you and me right now. Do you know this risen shepherd king? His name is Jesus. Have you felt his rescue from the power of sin and the fear of death? Jesus' solo work at the cross has lost none of its power. Jesus is in heaven, and his heart right now today is no less full of love than the day he went into battle and won the victory at the cross. David was God's hero the day Goliath was defeated. The question is today, who is your hero? Who is the hero of your life? Something to think about and chat about today. Who is the hero of your life? Well, the hero who came from David's family tree won the greatest victory and is the only one in all of history worthy of worship. And God says that. God says so. His name is Jesus. He rose victorious, and he is the best king forever. Wherever you are this morning, however young or old you are called to adore him, adore Jesus. Jesus did what no one else could do. We are called to trust him and to follow him, to listen to him and to worship him.